very often it's recommended to monitor impacts over the medium and long term, but you can't improvise that. And it has to be done on a sound scientific basis. And following the acute phase, sitting beside me here is Calvez, who works at Cedre, and he's going to tell you about the scientific studies of ecological impact assessments. Ivan, I'll give you the floor. Right, as Nicolas said, this presentation will concern our program for assessing environmental impacts and the program that we run following a spill, an oil spill on coastal environments. So the idea is to give you a fairly general presentation. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but rather tell you about how we implement this, what should be taken into account, how the program has been launched, and what the contents of the program are. So just a few general points and some background here, the motivations for doing this. When you have this has a direct impact on the way response is organized. The idea is to quickly present you with some feedback on two major pollution accidents in France, and in 78 and in 98, or 99, excuse me, to tell you what happened, what we were able to learn, what lessons we were able to retain from these experiences, and generally speaking, the outcomes of these programs and the impact that the programs were able to have. So give you what measures, what scope, what extent was concerned. And finally, give you a bit of perspective, the outlook for the future based on what we've learned. And we're comparing these two cases, but above all, providing complementary information about the two. And looking at some potential programs that the Cedre would be involved in, or maybe involved in soon, providing advice for post-pollution situations to various authorities, etc. So what we mentioned this morning in the case of a major spill, the authorities that are in charge of crisis management very often call for environmental expertise very quickly. Now, there's an emergency phase in the first hours, days, or even weeks. Sometimes we even see when there's a problem with a tanker drifting offshore, for example, you know that the potential for a problem is there. And this is when contacts are made with scientists and with those who are going to manage this situation. So people need to be involved rapidly about what the risks are, what the hazards are, right from the first hours and days, and before the spill actually arrives on shore. So it's not just assessing the impacts, but it's also providing information that enables a prioritization of what to do if you have potential impacts in a nature reserve or fishing grounds or flatfish nurseries, for example. So it's the first assessment, an initial taking stock of the situation. We try and understand what's going on and where the potential impact will be of either washing up or the spill going into areas with fish. And that is the first step in this emergency phase. But then beyond that, it's a question of trying to specify more specifically what the impacts are, what sort of scope they're going to have, their spatial extent, what resources, ecological resources, are going to be affected, fish or whatever. And this is where the monitoring program or scientific program comes into play. So an initial assessment, of course, is essential, but then we have to refine and structure the other activities for these assessments over the longer term. It's important to be able to specify what the impacts will be in the longer term. Now, the various stakeholders are involved here are shown on the screen in 3 different blocks. You have the public authorities on the one hand, who are in charge of crisis management, the scientific committee, and then much more broadly, the general public. That means town halls, municipalities, etc. as well. Now, their great expectation, in fact, the authorities and these entities want to be able to answer the public's questions and address their concerns very rapidly. In case of a major pollution event, Erica is an example, but it's not the only one. It's legitimate for people to wonder and worry. So very rapidly, it's important to bring the scientific experts into the organization. They too are able to answer the public's questions, and for people and for themselves to be able to rapidly get involved and work with the laboratories who are going to do studies, etc. And obviously each player is going to have his or her own job and capabilities with respect to the various expectations. So we're going to see in a moment how important, why it's so important to launch a program very rapidly and to appropriately target the actions above, and to be able to target the expectations. So initially, the implementing of an EIP, an Ecological Impact Assessment Program or plan. We can look at 2 examples to illustrate this. I mentioned Amico Cadiz was on the 16th of March, 1978. And here are the facts. There was scientific expertise. There's an inspection very early from the first slicks that arrived that were full of crude oil. There is a major spill very close to the coast, and it arrived almost immediately on shore. So we had this, and it so happened that in the immediate area there were laboratories for marine science, the marine labs at the University of Brittany, Western Brittany in Brest, and local expertise. So people who not only knew the situation, were familiar with the area, but were able to get there, to get on the ground quickly. Now, then over the first fortnight or first 20 days, there were experts from much further abroad, from the United States, for example. You had people from NOAA or the Environmental Protection Agency. There were scientists who came to learn from the experience. Same thing for Canadian scientists. And those who came from the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries in the UK. The French national authorities, you can see on the following day of the accident, the day following the accident, March 17th, the French Ministry of the Environment mandated, gave the remit to Cinexo to define and coordinate a national program to look at the study. And contracts were drawn up for this to mobilize all the required experts and activities. This immediate action was financed by the French Ministry of the Environment. And the specificity, but without going into too much detail, is there was a special fund created. It was called an Amico Transport Company Fund, and it was NOAA that managed it. And they actually had oversight of the French program. And this was done in July of 1978, so 4 months following the accident. And so NOAA was able to oversee this and look at how to coordinate it, basically. Now, let me have another example with a bit less reactivity, I would say. On the 19th of December 1999, or in December of 1999, a number of things theoretically had changed. There were contracts and deadlines and justifications, perhaps. People were much less free to mobilize their forces as quickly as had been the case for the Amico. And same thing was they had to wait for funding from the authorities as well. Finally, there was scientific expertise on the local level in the coastal ecology labs, for example, in the Loire-Atlantique region of France that was hardest hit by this pollution. And unfortunately, they weren't lucky enough to have such locally established labs as those existing in the Finistère region of Western France that were on the site practically for Amico. It took 2.5 months actually for decisions to be taken, for the first decision to be taken, because there was a creation of an interministerial committee, and the idea was to create a scientific network for monitoring ecological and toxicological impacts of the oil spill. And the other idea was to strengthen a national program which already existed, which is called LITO. And the idea was to see how this could be used to back up the approach to be implemented, this pre-existing program. So the Ministry of Amenities, Territorial Amenities and the Environment was in charge there, and there were calls for proposals, a choice of projects and players, and basically the national program was only really launched in December of 2000, which was literally 1 year after the spill took place. It was financed though for 5 years. And on the previous slide, as we saw that the French national program following the Amico Cadiz, in fact, was formed by representatives of the ministry, scientists from labs in Brest and elsewhere. And NOAA was in charge of steering the project, basically. NOAA Conexo, in fact, there were two programs, but by a joint scientific commission, they managed to ensure that there weren't any duplications of work being carried out, that these two programs were actually complementary rather than overlapping. And the Ministry of the Environment for Erica was in charge, basically, of ensuring that the program unfolded over time. There was a scientific committee as well, with French scientists and 2 European scientists who looked both in terms of the specifications and gathering the information coming back from the laboratories. They ensured the scientific consistency. As you can see, there were many stakeholders or players, including the ministry and the DRN, so the Regional Directorate of the Environment, and other agencies and organizations and directorates for water quality, etc., and Cedre as well was part of that. And then the local authorities, whether they be local or regional authorities, were also involved. And the idea was not just to provide scientific input and advice, but to ensure that the program was suitable for all parties concerned and that there weren't any gaps or loopholes that were left open. And as time went on and as the project unfolded, there were midterm or intermediate progress reports that were provided. And in terms of feedback, there's a word up on the screen about the funding aspect. It was some 12 million francs, French francs at the time, not euros. So it was 8 million francs that was allocated by the authorities for the Amico spill. And there were some 4 million euros to run programs funded by the Americans. So in June 1978, just 3 months later, excuse me, you had the SNEXO, a working group, a specific working group meeting between ICES and SNEXO. Basically looking at the overall situation. They provided feedback on what had been done to date at that point, 3 months later. And then following that, in November 1979, there was a symposium and they published proceedings and articles, reports. Then in June 1981, there was a Conexo report, and in October 82, a joint NOAA Conexo report. Now, there was a wealth of information in that. In Erica, you can see quite different funding aspects here. Some 30 million francs, French francs, so 4.6 million euros, basically. It was managed by the Ministry of the Environment. And then on a more local level, for more locally focused projects, the regional directorates were able to distribute this funding or manage it. The duration, the period was for 5 years for the projects managed by the Ministry of the Environment and 3 years for those managed by the regional directorates. So about the same number of projects, though, 38 in this case. And with respect to feedback and reporting of the results and summaries, there were scientific conferences. And then in October 2004, 5 years later, there were proceedings published that had proceedings of the symposium or the conference held in November 2003 at Ifremer. So between these results that were published more or less in detail, there was the development of a traveling exhibition. And in order to provide fairly generic information, there's a website created with monitoring of the ERICA that lasted for about 4 years. So if we look at lessons learned, we just have a few examples for the Amico, for example. Interesting progress was made in terms of the knowledge. This was very much a founding event. In this case, at the time, there's a successful identification of a number of processes in the Brittany area, Albert Sea Inlet area with soft substrates, etc. A lot of interesting experience was gained. And that could be interpreted and applied in other accidents. And then we looked at the range of impacts on populations, and it could be biological or population dynamics or structures of populations. Sometimes very specific to the benthic species. And we looked at highly variable, there we saw highly variable sensitivity, to hydrocarbons. There was an existing environmental sensitivity index. And then there were other aspects like population kinetics that were enabled to be enriched and developed. Now, I'm not going to go through the full list, but there were a number of tools that were used that were very interesting in terms of their application. So some of them, like the environmental sensitivity index, that had pre-existed. And then looking at biological responses. Biotic indexes or indices as applied to hydrocarbons. This was interesting to measure the status, the integrity of benthic populations following eutrophication with organic matter. This was done with specialists from the University of Brest. And a whole series of tools and indicators which were used to determine the degree of disturbance and perturbation that was brought by the oil spill. Then fauna, excuse me, that was a possibility to look at copepods and nemopods, etc. And then there was a novel approach that wasn't really pursued, but it was called Bighorn. This was a summarizing approach. The idea was to have a quick index that would enable you to determine how much biomass had been lost. There were some things lacking and inadequacies, I should say, that of monitoring how oil was distributed and degraded in the environment. The impact, assessing the impact on human health and monitoring. At the time, there were toxic compounds and components like BTEX that arrived in this very fresh crude oil that washed up. And we really didn't have data, the researchers at the time didn't have any data predating the spill. So it's really a lucky thing when you have reference data that can serve as a baseline. With the Erica, there were 4 strands, or categories, if you like. First of all, the spatial and temporal extent of contaminants, how they were distributed in the environment. Looking at transformation bioavailability with the metabolites that can be traced, etc. Impacts on living organisms in the supralittoral, intertidal, and subtidal environments and the species there. Because in fact, the sea sprayed the pollutants fairly high on the shore and the cliffs on the coastline. And then monitoring restoration and trends, the evolution of the coastline. This is in terms of geomorphology to reconstruct what existed and to look at changes in the part of the coastline which was affected. Now, it's a bit of a caricature perhaps, but I'm not an ecotoxicologist. And at the time, there were biomarkers which were validated at the time, and they were used for OSPAR, for example, during the Amico event as well, in its aftermath. And that was something really big at the time to have the introduction of biomarkers. And something very interesting is with respect to the baseline data. There were 2 initiatives because this was a reiterated and repeated expression of need to have reference data. So there were 2 observation networks. One to look at plants on shore, the terrestrial vegetation, taking an inventory, and another involved macrobenthic communities. This was the REBENT network, which was coordinated by Ifremer in Brest. And this was a pilot project for Brittany on the site hardest hit by the Amico Cadiz, and it was launched in 2003. So there were biosedimentary indices and other aspects monitored or studied. But of course, all this is very expensive, and you have to find the funding you need. And unfortunately, above and beyond these initial implementations, the updating was not really possible. That was the case for the CBNB project, and for REBENT, it was pretty much the same in terms of updating the data. Sometimes, depending on whether or not funding can be found, because there's ERDF, European funding, for example, working on the Loire estuary, for example, there were programs there or funding there which was used to involve part of Brittany to the north of the Loire River estuary. And something you can say is that sometimes the goal or the objective changed. Looking at the various legislation and other coming from the European Union level, like the Water Framework Directive, for example. And so there were initial objectives that were to simply provide baseline data or references, and then the monitoring approach evolved over time in following the various directives, etc. So all of the scientists, talking about oysters, there were methodological approaches with respect to researching biological responses, changes in conditions. Sometimes it was very difficult to compare and very difficult to summarize overall. Not always easy to determine how these results should be interpreted. Likewise, for certain forms of resources and descriptors, with respect to what happened in situ, you had biological responses, for example. And then over time, you had fluctuation and with potentially other factors which came into play. And when we saw changes that could be due to the climate or other sources of disturbance, and having noted all this and observed all this, there were recommendations made, for example, to use networks for these monitoring activities, and to determine which indicators, which techniques, and then which indicators would be appropriate for these kinds of surveys and monitoring. Now, very briefly, or I'm trying to go through this very rapidly. The interpreters will thank me. Very rapidly, then, we look at the implementation of the various EIA contexts. The management structures were variable after Amico. It was a question of improvising, because this was a new situation with respect to what was done for Erica, where things were more fully developed. And what's expected of this kind of organization is, of course, reactivity, and also to balance the practical side, the flexibility of the organization, and balancing that with the complexity of situations. For Amico, things moved quickly. For Erica, it took longer. Maybe it's somewhere between the two, which would have been ideal. But we knew that scientific expertise had to be assimilated and integrated, made part of this early on, and appropriately dimensioned expertise. And the other thing was to be able to, in order to be able to assess changes on the basis of what had previously existed. There were several committees, in fact, for scientific organization. And you had to see who was going to provide support, who was going to run studies. And then there was the scientific coordination, the monitoring of the program. And all this is very important. And this is important over the long term. The organizations steering this have to steer it to completion. And with respect to steering committees, you have unique consistency between what's in the studies and the expectations. That means on scientific level, societal level, and for public policies. The scientific community was mobilized, and we had roundtables, and we realized whether it would be for the Amico or for Erica, there were roundtable discussions, there were conferences. And I think what was important and should be again emphasized and stressed here is that they were able to move quickly. Now, creating stronger links and networks, working groups, reference contacts. And it was important for people to get to know each other and their ways of working, to see what will be the scope and the reach of a program, how and why we're doing it. And then the other question was, who is going to do what? Who is going to coordinate? It's going to be public authorities, private entities for this remit. Now, there's a lot of influence here with respect to which studies are made. And the longer the assessment is, the more you're going to be able to collect data. And the idea is if you lose time at the beginning, you also lose information and data as well. You see here that the organization and speed of organization has an effect and an outcome on the results. Also, two things that seem important to me with respect to the discussions that we had at Cedre. Again, I won't go into detail here and now, but we see that the techniques and tools have evolved, or evolved between Amico and Erica, and of course the Exxon Valdez in the United States, and the Aegean Sea in Spain, the Brer, Sea Empress, etc., all these other spills. Let's say in the 1990s, where there were environmental impact assessments following these aspects, you can see that for the Amico Cadiz, it was mainly ecological. In fact, the emphasis was on an ecological approach or level. And to some extent, looking at communities, a given species of fish, marine vegetation, or whatever. So you had quality indicators for the environment where this animal or organism was located. And with respect to the physiological aspects and the success in using descriptors of physiological activity, whereas for ERICA, more modern techniques and technologies were used, but at lower levels of biological organization, for example, markers for exposure. Vianney mentioned that earlier. And I won't go into detail. This is just to illustrate the various possibilities and approaches using DNA adducts, for example, and looking at the presence, for example, of lipid peroxides that in fact can compromise the survival of organisms which are present in hydrocarbons. So I won't go into detail here, but very simply, all this experience from ERICA shows that there was growth, an increase in the ability to detect or record fluctuations, and for a large number of descriptors. It could be molecules, cells, and very high resolution on small scales of time, so small geographical scales as well. And so we're looking at interpretation. We're looking at how these can be interpreted and whether they can be assigned to pollution. And of course, this can be due to hydrocarbon, and what effect it has on reproductive. But sometimes there are specific aspects using crossed biomarkers, etc., and the ecological meaning or significance of this. If we limit ourselves to small-scale approaches and looking at biological organization, I'm saying species, populations, communities, and that should complement and complete the ecological approach. To say it's interesting to see how an organism and at what level it's affected, because we studied immunotoxicology. Are there mortalities? Has the species disappeared? Etc. These are things that are interesting.
So this experience of concrete cases provides a whole variety of lessons, given that they're in different contexts and depending on the different tools that are available at that point. So the idea is to try and cross all this information and rather than opposing them. That's what we try to do at Cedre through symposiums, through roundtables, see what we can do with the lessons learned. The one point is reducing the time frame for designing and launching programs and studies. And a second important point is adapting the content to needs and questions. So we need to provide answers to concrete questions, some things that are far simpler than the studies developed by scientists. One of the questions that is often raised is how can we adapt methods? Could we predefine impact assessment methods or protocols that could be adaptable? So what currently exists? Well, in France, we have a guide for the revision of the specific marine pollution provision. It's called CT8. And although it has few detailed recommendations, in fact, in this document, at Cedre, we have a guide that was produced in 2001. It gives an overview of the different components, flora, fauna, and so on, within this scope. So it's educational, but it is not. It doesn't aim to go into detail of the methods used. We currently have another project that's in progress at Cedre. It's the development of a summary document. It's mainly, but not exclusively, intended for French organizations. By organizations, I mean the authorities, representatives of different ministries and so on, as well as scientific experts. So the aim is that it should address these different audiences. The idea is to set out a framework for an impact assessment program. What we're interested in is developing something that's educational, addressing the fact that every pollution incident is different. So the idea is to try and assess the incident, the extent, the characteristics of the pollutant, and therefore the risks of toxicity and the risks of impact. So these are important points, so we're developing this scientific content as well as information on vulnerability, for example, of habitats. And yes, I'm being told to stop. Yeah, I'll just finish off this slide. So yes, scientific content, a scientific approach targeted towards priority organisms. So I'll stop on this final slide. The idea is to use concrete examples to address impact assessment. There are programs that have been implemented since Amico Spill. So the idea is to illustrate what's been done in the past, and to kind of link what's been done following these different spills. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop there and hand over the floor.